The blood was still fresh on her fingertips when the guard turned the corner. She was crouched at the base of the east tower wall, her burgundy dress pooling against the cold, wet stone like spilled wine, her dark hair falling across her face in loose, tangled waves. Her left palm was pressed flat against the wall to steady herself. Her right hand was raised, one finger extended, drawing the last letter slowly into the surface. The torch at the far end of the corridor threw long shadows across the courtyard. A wind swept through from the valley below, carrying the smell of coming rains and something older beneath it, wet iron, damp earth, the particular cold of a castle that had stood for centuries and absorbed every secret poured into its walls. She did not flinch when she heard his footsteps. She had already known someone was coming. She always knew. Captain Aiden stopped 3 feet behind her. He was a veteran of border skirmishes and midnight patrols. He had pulled men out of burning buildings and carried them off battlefields without flinching. But there was something about this girl, this small, silent, hollow-eyed girl, that made his spine feel wrong every single time he found her here. He looked at the wall. The letters glistened beneath the torchlight, crimson and deliberate, drawn with the kind of terrible patience that only someone who had done this many times before could manage. The king will die before winter. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Aiden's eyes moved from the message to the girl's bleeding hand, and then back to the message again. The cut across her palm was shallow but precise, opened with something sharp, something she kept hidden on her person. He had never found it. He had stopped looking. "Clara," he said quietly. She turned her head and looked up at him. Her eyes were deep brown, almost black in the low light, and they carried an expression that he had never been able to fully name. Not fear, not guilt. Something older and heavier than either of those things. The expression of someone who already knew exactly how this moment was going to end and had decided to do it anyway. She looked back at the wall. "You shouldn't have written this one," he said. She did not react. She never reacted to things she had already anticipated. Aiden crossed his arms slowly. His jaw was tight. He had been pulling double shifts for 2 weeks since half the patrol roster fell ill from contaminated grain that Clara had warned about 4 months ago in letters 3 inches tall on the southern granary wall. Letters that the steward, Brandon, had ordered scrubbed away and the girl locked in a storage room for defacing castle property. The grain had turned black 10 days later. 40 people had been sick. 2 of them were still recovering. He looked at the message again. The king. Not a bridge, not a food store, not a hunting path. The king. If this warning was real, and Aiden's stomach had stopped pretending they weren't real sometime around the 4th month, then something catastrophic was already moving beneath the surface of Stonewatch Castle. Something that had been gathering in the dark for a very long time. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "Does it happen tonight?" he asked. Clara shook her head slowly. "Soon?" She held up her hand, fingers spread, and then curled 3 of them down. 2 months, maybe less. The wind picked up. The torch beside the gate flickered hard, nearly going out, then steadied itself. Somewhere far below, past the valley road, the sound of horns carried up through the dark. 1 long note, 2 short bursts. The arrival sequence. Aiden turned toward the sound without thinking, old instinct snapping his head around. His eyes searched the mountain road beyond the outer gate. Lanterns moved in the distance, dozens of them, strung between riders and wagons in a procession that stretched back around the first bend of the pass. Banners flew in the wind above them. Too dark to read from here, but the sheer size of the convoy left no question. His stomach dropped. The Alpha King's party, 3 days early. He spun back toward Clara. She was already looking at the approaching lights, and for the first time since he had started finding her on these walls, the expression on her face was not resignation. It was something that looked very much like relief, as if she had been waiting. As if the arrival of the very man she had just warned of death was somehow the best thing that had happened to her in 7 months. Aiden stared at her. She pressed his bleeding hand against her dress without looking away from the lights, and in the silence between them, with the blood still wet on the wall and the king riding through the gate, the captain made a decision he could not entirely explain. He did not call for the steward. He did not report the message. He stood quietly beside a mute Omega girl in a burgundy dress and watched the royal procession arrive, and he told himself it was because he needed more information. He was only half lying. Stonewatch Castle sits above the Ash River Valley like a fist pressed against the sky. It was built 300 years ago by an Alpha Lord who believed that walls thick enough could hold back any disaster. He was not entirely wrong. The castle had survived floods, fires, siege, and famine. Its stone was the dark gray of old iron. Its towers rose in 4 corners above the valley like sentinels that had long since stopped watching for anything worth reporting. The region it governed had once been prosperous. The Ash River Valley produced grain, livestock, timber, and fresh water in quantities that made it one of the more stable territories in the kingdom. Traders came through twice a season. The weekly market drew people from 3 neighboring settlements. The pack that lived under Stonewatch's walls had been large, healthy, and reasonably content. That was before. Now the market came once a month, and half the stalls sat empty. Now the river ran lower every year, and the fish had thinned to almost nothing. Now the grain stores were never quite full enough. The livestock died faster than they reproduced, and children fell ill in patterns that the healer Finn could not explain from any natural cause he recognized. Most people blamed hard luck. Some blamed the weather. A few blamed the neighboring packs to the east, whose wolves were said to hunt too close to the valley's water sources during the dry season. Nobody blamed the man who was actually responsible. Not yet. Clara had lived at Stonewatch Castle since she was 9 years old. She had arrived as the daughter of Mara, a woman who had served in the castle kitchens, kept her head down, and for a time, managed to hold herself and her child together in a world that did not particularly care about either of them. Mara had been bright, quiet, and watchful in the way that people become when survival requires them to be smaller than they actually are. She had noticed things, filed them away, drawn connections that most people were too busy or too afraid to follow. She had not been careful enough about who knew that. When Clara was 12, Mara died. The official story was fever, a quick illness, nothing unusual for the valley, where sickness sometimes moved through the lower quarters of the castle without anyone in the upper floors noticing for a week. The healer at the time had recorded it plainly and without curiosity. Brandon the steward had arranged for Mara's quarters to be cleared and reassigned within 3 days. Clara had been given a smaller room near the laundry, a pallet, a single blanket, and a list of chores. Nobody asked how she was coping. She had been mute since birth, not from damage or injury, but from something in the way she was made that simply produced no voice. She could hear everything. She understood everything. But she had never in her life produced a sound, not even a cry. And after Mara died, there was no one left in Stonewatch who thought of her as a person worth addressing directly, so people talked around her, over her, past her, and she listened. She listens to the guards complaining about reduced rations that should not have been reduced. She listened to the kitchen staff muttering about grain deliveries that came short and invoices that did not match what arrived. She listened to traders at the gate grumbling about inspection fees that changed without notice. She listened to the healer Finn, a kind and careful man, talking quietly to himself about illness patterns that followed the water supply with a precision that could not be coincidence. She noticed things her mother had noticed, and slowly, painfully, over the course of years, she began to understand what those things meant. The valley was not suffering from bad luck, it was being drained, deliberately, methodically, by someone who understood the castle's systems well enough to exploit them without triggering obvious alarm. Someone who had been doing it so slowly, over so many years, that the decline felt natural, inevitable, like weather. She could not speak, she could not write formal reports. She had no standing, no rank, no allies in any position of authority. But she had walls, and she had blood, and she had a terrible, unshakable need to make people see what she saw, even if they hated her for it. The first warning had gone up 7 months ago. She had cut her palm on a loose nail in the cellar wall, the same nail she kept hidden in the seam of her sleeve ever since, pressed her finger to the wound, and written 4 words on the east corridor wall before dawn: "The eastern grain is spoiled." The steward Brandon had ordered the wall scrubbed, and Clara locked in the root cellar for 2 days. The grain had turned 3 days later. 40 people fell sick. The second warning came a month after that, the Western Bridge. She had seen the inspector falsify the structural report, had been standing 3 feet away, invisible and ignored, when he tucked the real findings into his coat and handed Theo, the pack alpha, a document that bore no resemblance to what the bridge's supports actually showed. She wrote it on the wall near the Great Hall entrance at midnight. Brandon had her whipped for defacing castle property. The bridge had collapsed 11 days later. A merchant family's wagon went into the river. The father survived. The mother did not. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th warnings followed the same pattern with absolute reliability. Warning. Punishment. Disaster silence. Next warning. The castle had settled into a rhythm of disbelief that nothing could disrupt, because accepting the warnings as real would require accepting something deeply uncomfortable, that a mute Omega servant with blood on her hands could see what the castle's own leaders could not or would not. And that was a truth too expensive for most people to afford. The only exception in 7 months was Captain Aiden. He had never thanked her, had never apologized for the punishments he'd been ordered to carry out, had never directly told her he believed her. But he had stopped scrubbing the walls himself. He always waited for someone else to give the order now. And whenever he found her in the corridors after midnight, he took a few extra seconds before calling out. It was not much, but in Clara's world, a few extra seconds was the closest thing to kindness she had. The morning after the king's arrival, Stonewatch Castle woke up trying very hard to pretend it was prepared. The royal visit had been scheduled for 3 weeks. The castle had exactly 3 days of actual preparation before the convoy appeared at the gate, which meant that the kitchens were operating at full chaos, the upper guest quarters smelled of fresh paint that wasn't quite dry, and Pack Alpha Theo was wearing an expression that had not left his face since midnight, the expression of a man calculating exactly how many things could go wrong and in what order. In the great hall, servants moved in tight, anxious lines carrying linens and candelabras and trays of food that nobody was going to eat at 7 in the morning. Brandon the steward walked behind them, issuing corrections in a low, rapid voice, his ledger tucked under one arm, his rings catching the early light. He was a precise man, organized. The kind of organizer who kept excellent records of everything except the things that mattered most. Clara carried hot water from the kitchen up to the guest wing. Twice, 3 times, no one spoke to her, no one looked at her. The burgundy of her dress was the same as always, worn at the hem, clean everywhere else, the kind of clothing that had been decent once and was now simply functional. She moved through the castle the way she always did, efficiently, without drawing attention, noticing everything. She noticed, for instance, that the message had already been scrubbed from the east tower wall. Someone had worked through the night to remove it. She noticed that Captain Aiden had not reported it to Brandon, because Brandon was not looking at her with the particular cold fury he reserved for situations where he knew what she had done. He was looking at her with ordinary's disdain, the disdain of a man who considered her a nuisance that had not recently caused him specific trouble. She noticed that the king had not yet been seen in the main corridors, and she noticed, because she noticed everything, that one of the men who had ridden in with the royal party the previous night was not a guard and was not an advisor. He was moving through the castle the way she did, quietly, watching, noting things. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of sharp jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the castle walls. He wore a black traveling cloak with the royal sigil at the collar, but he carried himself with the easy stillness of someone who was only dressed formally because it was required of him. His eyes were the color of winter oak, dark amber with flecks of gold, and they moved across every room. He entered with a systematic attention that Clara recognized immediately. He was not here for the inspection, he was here looking for something. She watched him from the corridor outside the great hall as he paused in the doorway, cataloging the room with a single sweep. His gaze passed over the servants, the linens, the hurried preparations, then it stopped on the wall near the entrance. The one that had been scrubbed overnight, but not quite perfectly. If you knew what you were looking for, you could still see the faint ghost of letters in the stone. The place where the water had not quite lifted all the color out. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked down the corridor, directly at Clara. She did not move, he did not look away. It lasted 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then a voice from deeper in the hall called his name, Lucas, and he turned and walked away without expression. Clara pressed herself against the corridor wall and let out a slow breath. That had been the beta, Lucas, the king's second. His investigator, the man who, by every account she had ever overheard, did not come to places unless the king had already decided those places, needed to be examined very carefully. She looked down at her hands. The cut on her palm had been bandaged with a strip of cloth torn from the bottom of her underskirt, clean enough. It would hold. She did not know whether to be frightened or relieved. She decided after a moment that she did not have time for either. She had water to deliver. Duncan Lockhart did not sleep in the rooms they had prepared for him. It was not a slight against the castle. It was simply that he had not slept well in any prepared room since the 3rd year of his reign, when he had learned that the most dangerous thing a leader could do was become predictable. He was 31 years old, and he had spent 8 of those years learning the hard way that comfort and clarity rarely occupied the same space. He sat at the desk in the small working room off the main guest corridor, a room that had been stocked with candles and writing materials for correspondence but was otherwise unremarkable, and he looked at the report Lucas had placed in front of him an hour ago. It was not the official report. The official report, compiled by the castle's own record keepers and submitted through proper channels, described the Ash River Valley as a region experiencing ordinary difficulties, seasonal crop variants, minor illness outbreaks, infrastructure where typical of its age. It recommended modest increases in emergency grain allocation and a routine bridge inspection. Lucas's report described something else entirely. Grain shortages that appeared in the ledgers as routine loss but followed patterns inconsistent with natural spoilage. Infrastructure failures concentrated in structures that had passed inspection within the previous 2 years. Illness outbreaks clustered near specific water sources. Emergency fund allocations that left the Treasury records balanced but left almost no trace in the physical improvements they were supposedly funding. Duncan had seen this before. Not here, but in 3 other territories over the past 4 years. Different places, different names, different faces. The same architecture of quiet theft. Someone was systematically stripping the valley. "You saw the wall," he said without looking up. Lucas was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, in the comfortable way of a man who had been the king's shadow long enough to know that formality between them was generally a waste of energy. He was sharp-featured and impeccably dressed even at this hour, the kind of man who could make a plain gray doublet look intentional. "What was left of it?" Lucas said. "Someone worked fast with a bucket." The message, "The king will die before winter." Lucas delivered it with the precise flatness he used for information he was still turning over. Letters approximately 3 inches high, written in blood, not the first time apparently. Aiden was cagey about details, but he confirmed it's been happening for 7 months. Duncan set down the report. Same author, same method, same hand, a mute Omega servant, name is Clara. She's been here since childhood, and she's still here, still writing. Lucas paused. Every previous launch warning came true. Duncan looked at him. Everyone, Lucas confirmed. I pulled the incident records. Grain spoilage, bridge collapse, contaminated hunting grounds, sick livestock. She wrote them all before they happened. Aiden's account suggests the castle's response has been consistent. Punish her, ignore the warning, watch the disaster occur, repeat. The fire in the small brazier in the corner shifted. Duncan watched it for a moment. "I want to talk to her," he said. "She doesn't talk. Then I'll talk and she'll listen, and then she'll write." Lucas nodded slowly, quietly. "If Theo or Brandon know you're interested in her specifically, she'll be moved or worse before morning." "I know." He rose from the desk and moved to the window. The valley below was still gray with early morning mist, the river a darker line cutting through it. Beautiful, in a bleak sort of way, the kind of place that deserved better than what was being done to it. "We're not here for the routine inspection anymore," he said. Lucas uncrossed his arms. "No, what do you need?" 3 days to finish pulling the financial records. Access to the water supply logs quietly, through Finn if we can manage it. And someone to watch Chris. Duncan turned. "Chris," he said, "the nobleman. He arrived here 18 months ago. Came with excellent references. A substantial personal fortune. And the kind of civic generosity that makes people stop asking questions about where money is actually going." Lucas's voice was careful, even. His name appears once in the financial irregularities. Once is usually coincidence. His name appears 14 times. A long pause. "Watch him," Duncan said. Already started. Clara was elbow deep in laundry water when Captain Aiden appeared in the doorway of the washing room and told her, very quietly, that the king wanted to speak with her. She stared at him. He stared back. "I know," he said, reading her expression. "I know how it sounds. I also know you wrote about him on that wall last night, and this morning he is specifically asking for you by name, which tells me either he's about to throw you in a cell or—" He stopped, started again. "Just come, I'll be there." She dried her hands on her apron and followed him. The room Duncan had chosen for the meeting was a small record room off the east corridor, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of room people walked past without registering. He was standing at the far wall when they entered, reading a document, and he turned without hurry. The first thing Clara thought was that he was larger than she had expected, not in the way that dangerous men were sometimes large, brittle and wide and conscious of themselves. He was simply a man who filled the space around him without meaning to, broad through the shoulder, carrying his height without performance. He had taken off the formal cloak. He wore a plain dark doublet and looked considerably less like a king, and considerably more like someone who had been awake since before dawn working on a problem. His eyes found her immediately, those winter oak eyes. Not with the assessment she expected. Not the weighing look that men of rank gave servants when they were trying to determine how much trouble they were going to be. Something more careful than that, more patient. He looked at her the way you looked at something you were genuinely trying to understand. "Clara," he said. Not a question. She held his gaze. She did not nod. She did not bow. She was not being defiant. She had simply, after 12 years of being treated as furniture, forgotten the impulse to perform deference for people she had not decided to trust yet. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. "My name is Duncan," he said. "I know you already know that. I'm going to sit down. Because I've been standing since 4 in the morning, and I would like to think clearly. and I think more clearly when I'm comfortable. You can stand or sit or leave the room entirely. I'm not going to stop you." He pulled a chair out from the small table and sat in it in a way that managed to be neither imposing nor performatively casual. Just a man sitting down. Clara watched him for a moment, then she sat down across the table. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them and a stick of charcoal. "I read the incident records," he said. "Every warning you wrote, every outcome. I want you to know that I believe you." He said it simply, without decoration, no hedge, no qualification. Just, "I believe you, not because I think you have powers I can't explain. Because I think you're observant in a way that most people here have been too afraid or too comfortable to be. And I want to know what you've seen." Clara looked at the paper, then at the charcoal, then at him. She picked up the charcoal, and she began to write. She wrote for 2 hours. Her hand did not stop except to flip the pages that Lucas quietly slid into the room at intervals, standing at the door with his arms folded. Reading over her shoulder as she worked, his expression cycling through surprise and grimness, and the very particular look of a man whose theory is being confirmed in ways that are both satisfying and deeply troubling. She wrote about the grain records, the specific dates, the discrepancies she had noticed between delivery invoices and what actually arrived in the stores. Information she had gathered over years of standing silently in rooms where people talked as though she were a piece of furniture. She wrote about the bridge inspector and the false report she had witnessed being handed to Theo. She wrote about the water, about the patterns she had tracked, which wells produced illness and in what season, which fields ran adjacent to those wells, which fields belonged to which landowners. She wrote a name, Chris, and then she wrote, underneath it, "He was there when my mother died." The room went quiet. Duncan looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Your mother," he said carefully. "Mara." She nodded. "Tell me about her." Clara's hand paused. She looked down at the paper, then slowly she began to write again. Mara had been dead for 9 years, but the records of her death were surprisingly easy to find, which was suspicious, because the records of everything else she had touched were not. It was Finn who first made the connection. The palace healer was a quiet, methodical man with kind eyes and the permanently tired face of someone who genuinely cared about his work and had been doing it long enough to carry the weight of every case he had not been able to solve. He had been at Stonewatch Castle for 14 years. He had treated Clara twice, once for the welts from her second punishment, once for a fever, and both times he had done so without comment and with thoroughness that felt in this place like an act of moral resistance. Lucas came to him on the second morning and asked, without preamble, about illness patterns over the last decade. Finn brought out a set of records so meticulous they bordered on obsessive, detailed logs going back 11 years, tracking every illness he had treated, its symptoms, its duration, its outcome, and its geographic origin within the valley. He spread them on the table. Lucas studied them in silence for a long time. "These clusters," Lucas said, pointing, "years 3 through 6. And then again starting 2 years ago." "Yes," Finn said, "the gap in the middle, 18 months, I noticed it. I couldn't explain it by any natural pattern. Seasonal illness doesn't disappear for 18 months and restart, not without cause." "What happened 18 months ago?" Finn's face did something complicated. "Chris arrived," he said. "I had no reason to connect those things at the time. And the first cluster. Years 3 through 6, Finn was quiet for a moment. He looked at the records the way you looked at something you had always sensed but never allowed yourself to say directly. "The first cluster coincides with the period when a woman named Mara was working in this castle," he said carefully. "She came to me twice, not for herself. She was asking questions about the illness patterns, about the water sources, about whether I had noticed the correlation she was noticing." He paused. "She was very intelligent. She had a child. I told her to be careful about who she asked these questions near. Did she listen? She died 4 months later. The certificate says fever." He met Lucas's eyes. "I did not write that certificate." A silence settled over the room. "Who did?" Lucas asked. "The previous healer. A man named Wells. He left the castle 6 weeks after Mara died. Retired officially. I was brought in as his replacement." Finn folded his hands on the table. "I always found the timing of my appointment strange. I never asked about it, because I didn't know there was anything to ask." Lucas left the healer's quarters with 4 pages of notes and the very specific look on his face. That meant he was going to be terrible company for the rest of the day. He brought the notes to Duncan. Duncan read them standing up. As was his habit with information he found urgent, he set them down. He looked at Clara, who was sitting in the corner of the working room where they had set up an informal base of operations over the past 36 hours. Close enough to be consulted, given her own writing materials, included in every discussion through the simple mechanism of being present and handed paper when She had something to contribute. He had not been able to stop looking at her, not in any simple way. Not with the distraction of someone trying to make something into something it wasn't. He looked at her the way you looked at someone who kept surprising you, quietly and without announcement, who said difficult, true things with a charcoal stick and never flinched from them, who had been spending 7 months bleeding herself against a wall for people who hurt her in return, and had not stopped. Your mother was investigating this before you were, he said. Clara looked at the wall. She gave a single nod. Did you know? She hesitated. Then she wrote, I understood later, after I started noticing the same things. She was getting close, Clara wrote. She wrote it down. I never found what she wrote. We will, Duncan said. It was not a kingly reassurance. It was a statement of intention from someone who had spent 8 years of reign, learning that justice was not a thing that arrived on its own. Clara looked at him. He looked back. For a moment neither of them did anything, and the air in the small room felt briefly heavier than it should, in a way that had nothing to do with the investigation. Lucas chose this precise moment to walk in from the doorway. I found Brandon's old ledgers, he announced without preamble, the ones he claims he archived. They're in a sealed trunk in the South Tower, and the seal has been broken and applied at least twice. He looked between the two of them. Am I interrupting something? Said Duncan. Good. Because if the numbers in these ledgers match what I think they match, we are about to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the steward. The castle's east garden was one of those places that existed in the gap between the official spaces, not the grand courtyard, not the working yard, not the kitchen garden, a narrow strip of stones and overgrown rose bushes along the eastern wall, accessible through a door that most people had stopped bothering with because it stuck in damp weather, and the garden itself produced nothing useful. Clara had been coming here since she was 13. It was the only place in the castles where she was reliably alone. She was sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the rose bushes, her knees drawn up, watching the valley go amber in the late afternoon light, when she heard the door scrape open behind her. She did not turn. She heard him navigate around the worst of the overgrowth with the particular noise of a large person trying to be considerate of a space that was not sized for them. Then he sat down on the wall beside her, not too close, far enough to be respectful, close enough that the warmth of him was present. They sat without speaking for a moment, which was, Clara supposed, technically how all moments went with her. Torrin told me you come here, Duncan said. She glanced at him sideways. The cook. He described you as the only person in this castle with reliable taste. Duncan paused. He also told me, in a completely separate part of the same sentence, that the spiced pears in the East Garden were better than anything grown in the formal orchards, and that you were the only one who knew about them. I think he was trying to tell me something subtle, but I may have missed the subtlety. Clara felt something move in her chest, the particular warmth of a joke in a place that had not offered her many. She reached over and broke off a small branch from the nearest bush, late-season leaves, 2 small pears that were slightly past their best but still sweet. She held one out. He took it. They sat and ate pears from an overgrown garden, while the valley light went gold, and then amber, and then the particular deep orange that came just before the mountains blocked the sun completely. I need to ask you something, he said eventually, and I need you to know that your answer changes nothing about what we're doing. We're doing this regardless. I want to understand it better. That's all. She looked at him. When you write the warnings, how do you know? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the fold of her apron, where she kept a small square of cloth and the stub of charcoal she had started carrying with her since the investigation began. She smoothed the cloth on the wall between them. She wrote, I see things other people don't see because they don't look. I am in rooms when people don't think I'm there. I remember everything. I make connections. She paused, then added, There is no magic. There never was. He read it. The warnings feel like certainty, he said. It was not a question. She nodded, because by the time you write them, you have already gathered enough evidence that the outcome is essentially confirmed. Another nod. You've been doing evidence-based analysis on a castle's operations for 7 months, while bleeding yourself against the walls, without tools, without access, without anyone helping you. She tilted her head slightly in a gesture that, over the last 2 days, Duncan had learned to read as something between agreement and a mild correction of his framing. For 9 years, he amended. She touched the cloth and wrote, My mother did it for 3 years before me. He was quiet. The sun dropped behind the mountains. I'm sorry about your mother, he said. Clara looked down at the cloth in her hands, the letters she had written. His shadow fell across them at this angle, long and warm. She wrote slowly. She would have liked that someone finally listened. Duncan looked at her. The way he looked at her had shifted somewhere between the first morning and now. The systematic assessment was still there, but underneath it was something less controlled, something that did not belong entirely to the investigation. She was aware of it. She was also aware that she was not afraid of it, which was new. He looked back at the valley. "The warning you wrote about me," he said. "The king will die before winter." She waited. "What does it mean? Specifically, what did you see that made you write it?" She picked up the charcoal again. She wrote for nearly a full minute. When she turned the cloth toward him, the words read, "I heard Chris speaking to a man I did not recognize. 3 weeks ago, in the lower passage, they spoke about the inspection. About the king coming early, disrupting a plan. Chris said the king would be dead before winter, but then he said, or better yet, the king he is now. He will not survive what is coming, not unchanged." She wrote beneath it, "I think he was speaking about your authority, your understanding. The king you are before you see what this valley has become." And then? I did not know how to write that in fewer words at midnight. Duncan looked at the cloth for a long time. Then something happened to his expression that she did not expect. He laughed, not loudly, a quiet, genuine laugh, the kind that was more exhale than sound. "You were correct," he said. "I don't think I will survive this unchanged." He handed the cloth back to her. Their fingers touched. Neither of them moved for a second longer than was necessary. From somewhere inside the castles, Torrin's voice carried through the wall. "Supper, your majesty. I made the good bread. Do not let Lucas eat it all before you get there." A pause. "The bread is also for the girl with the peers. She knows who she is." Clara pressed her lips together very hard. "He is the loudest person I have ever met in my life," Duncan said. She wrote on the cloth. "He has been leaving extra bread outside my door for 3 years. He has never said a word about it. He is also the kindest," Duncan concluded. She nodded. They went in to supper. Brandon cracked on the third day. He had been holding himself together with the particular rigid control of a man who had convinced himself that his choices were not really choices, that he had been practical, not complicit, careful, not corrupt, that the things he had signed and the records he had kept and the questions he had not asked were simply the work of a man trying to preserve order in a difficult position. Lucas sat across from him in the small record room for 4 hours. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply placed documents on the table, one at a time, and explained quietly what each of them showed and how they connected to each other, and what the full picture looked like when they were laid side by side. Brandon watched the picture assemble itself across the table. His hand stopped moving at some point during the second hour. "The emergency grain allocations," Lucas said, setting down a document. "Requested 3 times in the last 4 years, approved at the royal level, funds transferred. According to the castle's own accounts, the grain was received, stored, distributed. But the village distribution records," he placed another document, "show no corresponding increase in village supply during any of those periods. The grain does not appear to have arrived." Brandon's jaw was very tight. "The infrastructure repair funds, same pattern, approved, transferred, receipts of completion filed, but the structures remain unrepaired. The bridge that collapsed had been signed off as fully renovated 8 months prior. The signature on that completion report." He placed the document in front of Brandon and pointed. Brandon looked at his own signature for a very long time. "He told me the work had been done," Brandon said. His voice had changed. The crisply professional tone had gone somewhere it wasn't coming back from. "I never inspected it personally. He said the contractors had completed it. I filed the paperwork he gave me, without verifying, without." Brandon stopped. "I was told to trust his assessments, by Theo, by the Pack Alpha himself. He said the nobleman had come highly recommended and that his infrastructure projects were above scrutiny. And you believed that? I had a family. I had a position. Chris is." He stopped himself again, harder this time. His hands pressed flat on the table. "He is not someone you question, if you understand what I mean." Lucas looked at him calmly. "I need you to explain what you mean." Brandon looked at the documents on the table. At the record of his own name, repeated across 4 years of falsified paperwork. At the ledger entries that told the story of a valley being quietly emptied while its people suffered. 3 months ago," he said slowly, "a servant came to me. She had written something on the wall near the kitchen corridor, about the grain stores. He did not say the name. He did not need to. I had it scrubbed. I ordered her confined, because," his voice dropped to almost nothing, "because if I acknowledged that her warnings were accurate, I would have to acknowledge that the records I had been filing for years were false. And then I would have to acknowledge who had been giving me those records." He looked up. "He told me she was unstable, that she caused trouble wherever she went, that her mother had been the same way." Lucas was very still. "Her mother," he said, "Mara. She had been asking questions, about the same records, about the same discrepancies." Brandon's voice had gone flat and hollow. "Chris recommended her dismissal. He told Theo she had been stealing from the kitchen stores. There was never any evidence of that. But Theo, he trusted Chris. He trusted his judgment. A pause. She died 3 weeks after she was dismissed. He pushed the ledger across the table. Take it, he said. Take everything. I will sign whatever you need. Lucas looked at the ledger, then at Brandon. You'll write it all down, he said. Every transaction, every instruction, every conversation, and you will not speak to Chris before you do. He'll know, Brandon said. The fear that broke through his voice then was not the administrative fear of a man worried about his position. It was the older, simpler fear of a man who understood clearly what happened to people who crossed the man in question. I know, Lucas said. Write it down anyway. Theo was a different and more difficult conversation. Pack Alpha Theo was not a villain. He was something arguably more frustrating. A man who had known that something was wrong for a long time and had chosen, consciously and deliberately, not to investigate, because investigating would require action and action would require courage he was not certain he possessed. He had let Chris into his territory because Chris had come with money and influence and the kind of visible civic generosity that made Theo look like a successful leader. He had signed the documents Brandon brought him because he trusted Brandon, and Brandon trusted Chris, and the chain of trust saved him from having to examine anything personally. He had punished Clara because Clara's warnings threatened the version of his leadership he was trying to maintain. Duncan faced him in the Great Hall, just the two of them, no audience, no performance, and laid out what the investigation had found. Theo sat in his chair at the head of the hall and listened. His expression went through 5 or 6 things and settled on something that was neither guilt nor defiance, but rather the exhausted resignation of a man watching a collapse he's spent years pretending was not imminent. What happens now? He asked. That depends on what you do next, Duncan said. You can cooperate fully, provide testimony, and allow the investigation to proceed without interference, or you can obstruct it. I would strongly advise against the second option. Theo looked down at his hands. The girl, he said after a long pause. The mute one, Clara. He looked up. The things she wrote. I told myself she was seeking attention. Because if she was right, Duncan said. She has been right 7 times. Theo flinched. Make it right where you still can, Duncan said. He was not without compassion. He simply refused to let compassion become an obstacle to accountability. Starting now, Chris was not what he appeared. That was, in a sense, the entire story, the entire architecture of what he had built and how he had built it. He was precisely what people wanted to see when they looked at him. A man of means and manners who had chosen to invest his resources in a struggling community, generous, calm, unremarkable in the particular way of people who have practiced being unremarkable. He had arrived at Stonewatch 18 months ago with an introduction from a regional council member who had himself received an introduction from someone now under investigation for financial irregularities in another territory. The chain of references, when Lucas eventually pulled it apart, looked like a series of doors that all opened the same way, with money, and the careful cultivation of exactly the right kind of trust. What Chris had been doing in the valley was not complicated, once you understood it. He had access to the valley's infrastructure funds through Brandon's office. He had access to the emergency grant allocations through his advisory role to Theo. He had, through a series of businesses operated under different names, contracts for every piece of repair and restoration work that had been commissioned in the valley over the past 4 years, work that had been invoiced and paid for and never completed, bridges left to weaken, water systems left to corrode, grain stores left exposed to conditions he knew would cause spoilage. The contamination of the water supply was not accidental. It had been deliberate, methodical, conducted in the manner of someone who understood exactly how long it would take for the effects to become visible, and timed the cycles carefully enough that no single outbreak was ever severe enough to trigger a full formal investigation. Mara had found the pattern. She had come close enough that he had felt it necessary to end it. Clara had found the same pattern 9 years later, because her mother had passed her something invisible, not documents, not names, but a way of looking at the world, the habit of noticing. The refusal to accept that coincidence was a satisfying explanation when patterns kept repeating. Chris had assumed that a mute Omega servant's bloody warnings on castle walls would continue to be treated as the outbursts of someone unstable. He had not planned for an early royal arrival. He had not planned for a king who listened. When he learned, from a source in the castle that he had maintained for exactly this kind of contingency, that the investigation had expanded to include his financial records and that Brandon had agreed to cooperate, he spent approximately 6 hours deciding on his next move. Then he went to the reservoir. Clara found the note under the door of the east garden. She did not know who had left it. It was not signed. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, on a small square of paper that smelled very faintly of the particular astringent compound that Finn used to preserve his medical records. The note said, "The reservoir, tonight." She stared at it for 3 seconds, then she went to find Duncan. The Stonewatch Reservoir sat at the top of the eastern ridge, a large stone-lined basin fed by 3 mountain springs that supplied water to the castle and the lower village. It was an engineering achievement 300 years old, maintained through decades of careful stewardship. If it was compromised, there was no secondary supply, not for the castle, not for the village below. If Chris introduced enough of the compound Finn had identified in the valley's illness history into the reservoir feed, not the gradual, careful contamination of the past 4 years, but a concentrated, deliberate dose, the effects would reach the village within 48 hours. In the quantities he now knew he was capable of deploying, the effects would not be limited to illness. Duncan moved within 15 minutes of reading Clara's note, Lucas and Aiden with him, Finn running alongside with his medical kit, and the precise, furious expression of a man who had been patient about injustice for too long, and had reached the end of his patience. Torrin appeared at the stable yard as they were saddling horses. "I'm coming," he announced, in the voice of someone who was stating a fact rather than requesting permission. He had a large knife at his belt, a kitchen knife, because it was what he had, and an expression of absolute determination. Lucas began. "The girl has been bleeding herself on walls for 7 months for this castle," Torrin said flatly, "and before her it was her mother. I have fed that child for 3 years and looked the other way and told myself it wasn't my place. It is my place." He mounted the spare horse with more efficiency than expected from a castle cook. "Let's go." Lucas looked at Duncan. Duncan looked at Torrin. "Ride close," was all he said. They reached the reservoir path as the last light left the sky. Clara was already ahead of them. She had not waited. Duncan would realize later that he should have expected this, that a woman who had spent 7 months walking into a castle's worst corners in the middle of the night with nothing but a nail and a piece of cloth was not constitutionally capable of waiting outside while the problem she had identified was being addressed. She was at the top of the ridge path when they came around the last bend, and she was not alone. Chris stood between her and the reservoir gate. He was very still. He had the physical stillness of someone who had spent years practicing the appearance of calm. He looked even now like a man who had done nothing wrong and was merely curious about the noise. In his hand was a sealed container. Small, metal, the kind of container Finn had described when he explained what he suspected was being used to contaminate the water supply. Clara stood 12 feet away from him. She had not written anything. She had nothing to write with. She was simply standing between him and the gate, with the particular expression she wore when she had already decided something, and the decision had ceased to be reversible. "Clara," Chris said. His voice was very pleasant, very measured. "You have been nothing but trouble since your mother started this nonsense. I had hoped the apple had fallen further from the tree." He took a step toward her. Clara did not step back, and then Duncan was there, between them, his voice carrying across the ridge with the clean authority of a man who had spent 8 years refusing to let power be used as theater when it was needed as fact. "Put it down." Chris looked at him. The pleasant expression held for exactly 2 seconds before it stopped being useful. "Your Majesty," he said, "this is a misunderstanding." "No," Duncan said, "it isn't." Behind him, Aiden and Lucas had fanned out on either side. Torrin stood at the path's edge, large and very certain, holding the kitchen knife in the manner of someone who had never threatened anyone in his life but was fully prepared to make an exception. Finn pushed past them toward the reservoir gate, pulling out his kit. "Don't let him check that seal," Chris said quickly, something breaking through the surface of the calm. "He will check it," Duncan said. "And everything you have done in this valley over the past 4 years will be documented. You will answer for it. You will answer for the bridge that collapsed and the family that died. You will answer for the children who were sick from water you deliberately poisoned. You will answer for the grain you stole from people who were already hungry, and you will answer for Mara." The pleasant expression was completely gone. What was underneath it was something smaller and harder and much less impressive. Chris's hand tightened on the container. "Don't," Aiden said from the side. His voice was very quiet, very final. A long pause. Chris looked at the container, at Duncan, at the line of people between him and the gate, at Clara, who was standing completely still, watching him with those dark eyes that had been watching everything in this castle for 12 years. He set the container down. Aiden had him secured before the sound of it hitting the ground had finished echoing off the ridge. The gathering was held in the Great Hall 3 days later. It was not a formal royal proceeding. Duncan had specifically avoided that framing, Formal proceedings gave people reason to perform rather than listen, and what this valley needed was truth delivered in a way it could absorb. Every person in the castle was there, servants and guards, and kitchen staff and stable hands and advisors, and the merchants who had stayed on since the inspection began in the village, representatives who had been summoned from below. Theo sat at the front, stripped of his formal chain of office, his hands folded on the table in front of him with the posture of a man at the beginning of a very long reckoning. Brandon sat beside him and had the look of someone who had not slept in 3 days, but had used the time to write 17 pages of detailed testimony that were now in Lucas's possession. Chris was not at the table. Chris was in the castle's stone-walled holding room, which had not been used for anything significant since the previous century, and was finding it rather less comfortable than the noble quarters he had occupied for the past 18 months. Duncan spoke first. He laid out the investigation's findings clearly and without embellishment: the fraudulent contracts, the stolen emergency funds, the falsified infrastructure reports, the deliberate contamination of 3 of the valley's primary water sources, including the near miss at the reservoir, the evidence connecting Chris to the deaths of livestock, the illness outbreaks, the food shortages that had been written off as bad luck for 4 years. He spoke for 20 minutes. The hall was very quiet. Then Lucas presented the financial documentation, the contracts, the accounts, the paper trail that began and ended with a name, and connected that name to every disaster the valley had absorbed in 4 years. The silence in the hall had a texture to it by this point. It was the specific silence of people absorbing something that reframed the past, not just understanding what had happened, but understanding what it had cost, what they had lost, what had been stolen from them in the form of children who got sick and animals that died and bridges that collapsed, and winters that should not have been as hard as they were. It was the silence before grief, and then Finn stood up and spoke about the water supply. He spoke about the compound he had identified. He spoke about the illness patterns he had tracked for 14 years and the 18 months of remission that corresponded exactly with Chris's arrival, because Chris had paused the contamination cycle while he established himself, before resuming it when he was confident enough in his position. Finn was not a man who raised his voice often. He raised it now. These children were sick because someone chose to make them sick, he said. These people died because someone chose to let infrastructure fail. This valley has not been unlucky. It has been robbed, and the person who robbed it counted on you to believe it was bad luck, because bad luck does not require accountability. Bad luck cannot be arrested. He sat down, and then Aiden stood. He did not look at anyone in particular when he spoke. He looked at the floor. 7 months ago, a girl in this castle wrote on the wall near the east tower. I found her. The message was about the king. He paused. I did not report it that night. I told myself it was because I needed more information. The truth is, I had already stopped believing the warnings were coincidence, and I did not know what to do with that. I had punished her before. I had followed orders I knew were wrong, because the alternative felt too large. He looked up. I should have listened sooner. I didn't, and I am sorry for what that cost her. He sat back down. The hall was very still. Clara was sitting at the end of the long table. She had a piece of claw in her hands, and the charcoal stick, and she had been writing steadily since Finn began speaking. Duncan looked at her. She looked back. He gave her the smallest nod. She stood up. The hall turned toward her. She had been mute her entire life, not damaged, not broken, not incapable of understanding or feeling or thought. Simply without a voice in the literal sense. The mechanism that produced sound had never worked in the way it worked for others, but she had hands. She held up the cloth, and she read what she had written aloud, not in sound, but by turning the cloth so that everyone in the hall could see, slowly as her hand pointed to each line. My name is Clara. My mother's name was Mara. She noticed what I noticed. She tried to report it. She died because someone needed her to be quiet. I started writing on the walls because it was the only surface I had, and blood was the only ink I could not be deprived of. She held up the second piece of cloth. I do not have visions. I do not have powers. I have eyes. I have memory. I have 12 years of standing in rooms where no one thought to watch what I was watching, and I have been telling you the truth for 7 months. She turned the cloth one more time. The evidence exists. The records exist. The water will be clean. The valley will recover. This is what accountability looks like when it finally arrives. She put the cloth down. She sat. The hall was silent for 3 seconds. Then from somewhere near the back, a single person began to applaud. It was Torin. Of course it was. The consequences were delivered without ceremony, which Duncan had always believed was the appropriate way to deliver them. Chris was formally charged and transferred to the royal courts for trial. The evidence Brandon had compiled, the testimony Finn provided, and the financial documentation Lucas had assembled left very little room for the proceedings to be anything other than conclusive. He faced charges of financial fraud, deliberate contamination of public water supply, conspiracy in the death of Mara, and the obstruction of civil infrastructure resulting in loss of life. He was not a man who took loss gracefully. He maintained the pleasant expression through the first session of proceedings and abandoned it entirely by the second, at which point a court observer noted that he had finally, after a lifetime of presenting one face to the world, run out of room to hide behind it. Theo was removed from his position as Pack Alpha. The removal was not punitive in isolation. It was the necessary consequence of years of choosing comfort over responsibility. He accepted it without protest, which was perhaps the first clean thing he had done in a long time. He retired to his family's holdings east of the valley and was, by all accounts, a considerably more honest man once the performance of leadership was no longer required of him. Brandon was prosecuted for complicity in the falsified record-keeping. His cooperation with the investigation was documented and weighed by the court. He received a formal censure, a period of supervised service rather than imprisonment, and the particular burden of knowing that his excellent record-keeping abilities had been used for a decade to obscure theft. He directed those same abilities toward the reconstruction of the valley's financial records, working under Finn's oversight, and produced an accounting so thorough that Lucas used it as a model for similar investigations in 3 other territories. Aidan was promoted. It was overdue. He became the valley's captain of the guard proper, no longer on extended secondment, with the authority he had been exercising in practice for years made official at last. He was, by general consensus, the same as he had always been except that he slept better. Lucas was appointed Duncan's chief investigative advisor, a role that had existed in function for years and was now given a name and the formal standing it deserved. He was pleased about the title and then immediately pretended to be indifferent about it, which fooled no one. Finn led the establishment of the valley's first formal public health board, with authority over water safety, illness reporting, and infrastructure medical impact. He developed a protocol for detecting the type of contamination Chris had been using, and distributed it to healers in 6 neighboring territories. 2 of those healers wrote back within a year to report that they had found evidence of the same compound in their own water supplies, which confirmed what Lucas had suspected, that Chris was not operating alone, and that the network he had built extended well beyond Stonewatch. The investigation that began in a small room with a mute Omega and a stick of charcoal eventually reached 14 territories and resulted in the exposure of a coordinated fraud system that had been operating for nearly 20 years. It became in time one of the more significant accountability actions of Duncan's reign. Torrin received official stewardship of the royal kitchens, a thing he accepted with the expression of a man who had been quietly waiting for the world to catch up to something obvious. He continued leaving extra bread outside the door of anyone in the castle he thought needed it, because that was simply who he was, and authority had not changed him and was not going to. The valley itself recovered slowly and then, as things that have been suppressed tend to do when the suppression ends, quickly, water clean, grain stores full, bridges repaired, actually repaired, by contractors who were paid once and verified twice. The market resumed. The fish returned to the river, which Finn attributed to the improvement in water quality with the satisfaction of a man who had been tracking the relationship between those two things for 11 years and was glad someone had finally done something about it. Children stopped getting sick the way they had been getting sick. That, more than anything, made people understand what had been done to them and what it meant that it had stopped. Clara stayed at Stonewatch. This was not in the end where she had expected to be, but then she had not expected most of what the last months had contained. She had expected to keep writing warnings that nobody listened to until she ran out of time. She had not expected a king who arrived 3 days early and asked to hear what she had seen. She had not expected someone to look at her the way Duncan looked at her. He came back to the East Garden more than once, and then more than several times. She always brought pears when the season allowed, and the small cloth and charcoal she kept in her apron pocket, and the silence between them was never the kind that needed to be filled. It was the kind that already contained things, warm and specific. The particular silence of 2 people who had run out of pretending they didn't prefer each other's company. He told her, one evening in early winter when the frost had come down from the mountains and the valley was the particular blue-white of the cold season, that the official report of the investigation would carry her name, not as a witness, not as a subject, as a primary contributor to the identification and documentation of the conspiracy. She looked at the cloth in her hands. She wrote, My mother's name too. Yes, he said. Of course. She looked at the valley below, the clean river, the lights of the village, the world that was slowly becoming what it should have been. She wrote, "The king she was afraid you were, before winter. What happened to him?" He considered this for a moment. The fire inside through the window, the cold, clear night outside, the valley below them, quieter and better than it had been. He didn't survive, Duncan said. You were right about that part. She looked at him. He's been replaced by someone who listens, he said. Someone who knows that the quietest voices in a room are sometimes the only ones telling the truth. She put down the charcoal. She did not write anything. She looked at him in the way that she had been learning over the last several months, to allow herself to look at people she had decided to trust, fully, without reservation, without the careful management of exposure that had become second nature after years of being invisible. He looked back. I intend to stay longer than the inspection requires, he said quietly. As a statement of fact, she reached over and took the charcoal stub. She wrote, "Good." The fire inside cast long, warm shadows through the window. The valley below was still. The walls of Stonewatch Castle were clean. And for the first time in 7 months, for the first time in 12 years, Clara had nothing left to warn anyone about.